Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on children living in fragile contexts, and specifically take a deeper look at disadvantage, how we define it, and how we measure it. The role of data is critical to understanding disadvantage, and in this lecturette we will also look at how data is used to define and measure disadvantage. And in lecturette 2, we're going to explore how communities and governments respond to communities identified through data as being disadvantaged. Overall, most Australians do not live in disadvantage. However, for those who do, understanding what constitutes disadvantage and, more importantly, developing effective support and remediation plans are an essential work of government and community organisations. And it's important work because we know that if children are growing up in communities and family environments where disadvantage exists, they are at increased risk for developmental impacts. As we begin to consider community disadvantage, it's often helpful to think around how communities are clustered. And in this country, like many other developed countries in the world, the notion of people living within the boundaries of a postcode is not an unhelpful framework to gather our thoughts. And not all Australian postcodes are equal. Socially and economically, postcodes can be poles apart. For example, if we take a random sample of postcode 3142, or 2308, there's very significant differences between the levels of advantage or disadvantage in these two simple examples. The former, 3142, represents an area of great affluence and opportunity, while the latter belongs to one of the country's most disadvantaged locations. Vinson in 2007 found that disadvantage is highly concentrated in a very small number of areas in Australia. In fact, just 1.7% of Australian postcodes and communities account for over 7 times their share of the main focus for entrenched disadvantage. Things such as low income, limited access to computers and the internet, early school leaving, higher levels of prison admissions and confirmed child maltreatment. And I suppose it's this highly concentrated levels of disadvantage in our broader communities that have governments marshalling resources and strategic planning to address the issues that this 1.7% of our Australian postcodes actually represent in the lived experiences for children and families in those communities. So what do we even mean when we say community disadvantage? The quote that you can see on your screen is a really nice quote from Kafka, and it states that community disadvantage comes about as a result of the complex interplay between characteristics of residents living in a community and the effects of social and environmental context within the community. And so the idea that economic factors alone are the foundation for advantage or disadvantage undermines the complexity and scope of the notion of disadvantage. This view also erroneously implies that the economic solutions alone are adequate responses to community disadvantage. There are a number of new perspectives that have recently emerged in the last decade or so that highlight the multifaceted nature of disadvantage and demand a more sophisticated response to it from governments and local support agencies and communities themselves. In addition to the theoretical advances, there have also been advances in the measurement of community advantage or disadvantage, and advances in theoretical understandings and the means to measure community disadvantage increase the potential for policymakers to develop really effective public policy to get in there and try and fix some of long-term sustained disadvantage. And for practitioners, these advances have the potential to enable a much more in-depth understanding of families' needs and experiences and the way that they too can support families in these communities and the disadvantage that they face on an everyday basis. So what are some of the new ways that we are beginning to understand the complex nature of disadvantage? Moving beyond the traditional view of disadvantage being defined by purely welfare economics, emerging approaches have redefined how we think about this complex notion of advantage or disadvantage. Economic measures are still really important element of understanding both family and community issues. However, broadening this approach to examine social capital and the degree of social inclusion or social exclusion, and examining the scope of communities' capabilities to fulfill a positive life experience are just some of the nuanced ways that we now understand the complex interplay between the characteristics of residents, so the personal attributes of people living in a community, and the environmental context in which they live, beyond the dollars and cents. So, over the next few slides, what I'd really like to do is take a deeper look at the component elements that we now use to measure and identify community disadvantage. So, we're going to take a closer look at economics, social capital, social inclusion, and a capabilities approach. So, let's take a look at what social capital actually means and how it helps us to define the level of disadvantage that may be present in a community. So, you can see the graphic on this slide that speaks to social capital, giving us an understanding of the types and healthiness of the networks that are established within community, the sense of feelings of trust and safety that exist in community, the notions about reciprocity, so how people interact and support each other in an even way. So, not victimization, but that sense of agency and participation, and the notion around citizen power and proactivity, and the level of the values and norms and the outlook on life that we can see exist in a whole of community sort of aspect. And of course, that diversity is seen as part of the healthy profile of a community rather than a divisive element. And overarchingly, that people feel that they belong to the community, that they're not socially isolated from that community. And so this approach allows us to look beyond the pure economic profile of communities, and it allows us to understand some of the lived experiences of community members. And when we start to think about communities against these sorts of criteria, we begin to understand that we can have two communities who may have very similar economic profiles and yet be poles apart in their levels of social capital. We can have communities where there's a feeling of being unsafe, and that where they don't trust their neighbours, and where networks aren't established as well as what they could be, and where there's a sense of disempowerment and victimization that can occur in some communities. So being able to look beyond the dollars and cents helps to give us a much more deeper understanding of where the problem may exist, and then more importantly, what communities and governments in the macro and exosystems can do to actually fix or put in place programs to help communities fix these issues for themselves. So, closely aligned to the notion around social capital is this construct of social inclusion or exclusion of members of a community, giving us some indication as to the overall level of community advantage or disadvantage. And so, in 2008, Australia's social inclusion policy approach really defined social inclusion as having people having opportunities to participate in society through employment and access to services, to be able to connect with family, friends, and the local community, and to be able to deal with personal crises, and importantly, to be able to be that sense of being able to be heard. So, social exclusion defines the impact of the lack of all of these things and speaks to the multidimensional nature of disadvantage and the limitation for people to optimise the opportunities that present as being a member of community. Social inclusion speaks to the degree of connectedness to the wider community that individual people feel they have, the level of autonomy and self-determination, and the connections they hold to all other aspects of societal life, including how they connect with the meso, exo, and macro systems. Social inclusion also highlights people's sense of resilience in the face of difficulty in their communities. Do they feel isolated from the community and systems, or an active part of it? So, thinking about the types of opportunities that people have in their communities to participate and connect and have the resilience to deal with crises and have a voice really highlights then for us as practitioners the opportunities that we have in identifying where those gaps may be, and then thinking about how do we actually amplify people's opportunities to engage in these types of things. And in so doing, again, it's another example of thinking about disadvantage beyond simply providing people with money to solve their problems. So, another way to view communities and for the level of advantage or disadvantage is this notion around a capabilities approach put forward by Nasbaum. So, the capabilities approach really asks us to examine what are people able to accomplish as living within their communities. And there's a range of, or a list of basic capabilities that Nasbaum suggests are a centralised constitutional principles that all citizens have a right to demand from their governments. And they include things like being able to live to the end of the human life of a normal length, so not dying prematurely, about having a healthy existence, being able to have good health, including reproductive health, and adequate nourishment and shelter. It's also about bodily integrity, being able to move freely from place to place, safe from physical or sexual assault, and having opportunities for sexual satisfaction and for choice in matters of reproduction. And then the senses and imaginations and thought, so being able to use our senses to imagine and think and reason, and to do these things in a way that is informed and cultivated by adequate education, so that notion around freedom of expression. And of course, then there's another aspect of emotions, being able to have attachments to things and people's outside of yourself. And so not having one's emotional developing stunted by overwhelming levels of fear or anxiety or by traumatic events such as abuse or neglect or war. And then being able to have form a conception of the good and to engage in critical reflection about the planning of one's own life. And then the notion of affiliations, being able to live for and in relation to others, and to recognise and show concerns about other human beings, and to engage in various forms of social interactions. And the notion around being able to understand living and concern for others in relation to animals and plants and the world and nature, and being able to laugh and to play and enjoy recreational activities. And then control over one's own environment. So having that sense of agency and to be able to participate effectively in the political choices that govern one's life. So in this capabilities approach, disadvantage is conceived as a restriction of people's capabilities. For example, looking at the list above, a disadvantaged community may be one in which a large number of the people living there have inadequate standards of health, or perhaps are subject to physical dangers, or they have their emotional lives diminished by fear and anxiety, and do not have a chance to interact freely with their peers and have little control over their circumstances. So it's a very global view around what does community disadvantage actually take into account, and gives us another lens to consider how we can plan to make sure that people are able to accomplish these very basic elements of a life well lived. An economic way of actually measuring disadvantage in our communities in Australia is one that you've probably all heard of, and that's called the CEFA. So that's the Socioeconomic Indices for Australia. And socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage in terms of how people access material and social resources and the ability to participate in society is what CEFA actually measures. And in doing so, it uses 4 indexes to gather information, including the Index for Relative Socioeconomic Disadvantage, so that looks at income levels, so low income, education levels, and occupation status in communities. The CEFA also uses an index for relative socio-economic advantage, so very similar to disadvantage. This index looks at the levels of high income, high education, and high status occupations that are present within a community. So those are the 2 big ones. So they map map our communities to see what is the level of income. Is it low or high? What's the level of average education within a community? Is it basic or non-existent, or at tertiary level or above? And what types of common average occupations people have within communities. And then they actually also look at another index for economic resources. So, what sort of access to economic resources do people have living in a particular community? And then finally, it's the index of education and occupation. So, again, looking at what are the general levels of education and occupation skills of people within that defined community area and that postcode area. And so when they bring all of that information together, they rank it and sort it and rate it. And communities are actually given a CEFA number. So CEFA scale runs from 1 through 10, 1 being our most disadvantaged communities and 10 being our most affluent communities. So disadvantage and many of the social programs that governments and communities put together to solve the issues of disadvantage can be found in communities that are CEFA 1 through 4. From 4 and about 7, we would consider that the income levels within those communities are about average. And then, of course, anything above that is usually our more affluent communities across Australia. So you'll see that many of the social programs that we're going to be talking about in our next lecturette are actually targeted into low CEFA communities. And then on top of that, we then have to layer all of the things that we've just been speaking about in terms of social exclusion and social capital and a capabilities approach to make sure that the planning that goes into these disadvantaged communities are actually fixing the right issues, and we understand what the problems are in the first place. And a final lens to consider around disadvantage is the work done by Vincent in 2007 in his Dropping Off the Edge Distribution of Disadvantage in Australia report. And in this report, he actually categorised disadvantage under 5 different headings, and that's one of social stress, health, community safety, economic factors, and education factors. So you can see there that he's looking at communities, for instance, in social stress that look at the family income, rental stress, housing stress, and lone person households as contributing factors to social stress. In the health category, he was looking at information around what is the birth weight, is there low birth weight issues running a community, what's the level of childhood injuries in community, what's the immunisation rates in a community, is there a higher proportion of sickness and disability, mortality rates, mental health issues and suicides in community, community safety, things like confirmed child abuse, criminal conviction, prison admissions and domestic violence, economic factors such as the level of skilled workers and unemployment, is there issues of long-term unemployment and dependency and low income, and access to computer use and internet access. And finally, in education, is there absenteeism from school? Are people leaving school early? Is for their local population? And what are the levels of post-school occupation? And in doing so, he gathered this information from a range of different areas, including Medicare, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and state and territory governments and health insurances to map the presence of conditions that lead to disadvantage. And it's not hard to envisage that the conditions in communities from thinking about these descriptions and to consider the possible impacts for children and families if these conditions are actually present in their local communities. So you can see that this type of work has helped us in redefining the work that policymakers and indeed communities themselves have in providing a better roadmap to look at the planning to support the gaps in their communities and to address some of the issues of disadvantage. The federal government and many community agencies work tirelessly to plan to close the gaps in communities where they know disadvantage is present and likely to be sustained. We know that disadvantage can be generational, and fixing the issues takes a long time, and often the results are really hard to measure. Given the investment and focus, understanding the complexities is really essential in dealing with community-based disadvantage. In our next lecturette, we're going to move beyond understanding how we think about disadvantage to taking a really good look at some examples of community responses that have been implemented across the country to deal with the issue of community-level disadvantage. These programs give you a really good insight to the sorts of work that you will come across as you work with children and families in communities.